Although unable to attend in real time, I recorded my talk, and I hope by that to be able to contribute something to the very interesting, I'm sure, session. I was asked to speak about women's role in Yemen's Arab Spring, also known as the Youth Revolution, Thawat Shabab Yemen, by focusing on the contribution of the mother of the revolution, Tawakkul Karman. So I think that answers, in part at least, the question, why Karman? But I also want to talk about the experience of women during the current crisis, the civil war in Yemen, civil regional war more accurately, entering its 9th year. So following a chronological turn of events, I limit my discussion to 3 things. Tawakkul Karman and her contribution to the Yemen's youth revolution, which is the beginning or hopes for the beginning of change for women and, in fact, for all Yemenis. The transitional process, especially the NDC, the National Dialogue Conference, which meant the actual beginning of change and realizing the change. Women also made some impressive achievements at the NDC. And the war started in March 2015, actually a little earlier, civil war in September 2014, and its disproportionate effect on women, which I have to say, even as an optimist who sees women's agency and opportunities even during hard times, the war made women's situation much worse than before. Starting with Karman, a Yemeni human rights and women's rights activist, a journalist, co-founder of and chairman of Women Journalists Without Chains and the Tawakkul Karman Foundation. She is of course not the only prominent woman activist in Yemen. I can think of other worthy of talk such as Afra Nasser, Nadia Istakaf, Amal Basha, Raufa Hassan, Muna Luqman, and others, but Karman, I think, is undoubtedly a leading figure and a symbol of Yemen's struggle for political and social change, even before 2012, and certainly after, known among Yemenis as the Iron Man and the mother of the revolution, as we mentioned. She is perhaps the most known and popular Yemeni activist since receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in 2011. She's also representing, I think, a form of activism which is different from the activism of Amal Basha and Raufa Hassan, for example, whereas their activism would be related more to academia or politics. I think Karman's activism is more, in some ways at least, Islamic. Although she did test more than once the boundaries of her political home, the Islamic Yemeni Reform Party, Islah. I think Stacy Filbert-Kieta describing Karman and her contribution as cause and effect is very accurate. She is referring both to Karman's role as a female activist in Yemen society, a conservative and patriarchal society, and the emergence of her voice within Islam, and to her leadership and advocacy as inspiration to other women to take part in political and social activism and to take part in the Yemeni Arab Spring. Karman paid a price for her activism over the years prior to 2011 and after. Her actions led to her arrest in 2007, in 2010. She was demonstrating against government corruption or calling for the release of detainees held without trial. She participated and led protests calling former President Ali Abdullah Saleh to step down and to establish and for the establishment of democratic government in Yemen. In 2012, the beginning of the Arab Spring in Yemen, the youth revolution, she was also arrested and detained several times during peaceful demonstrations. For months, her second home was the tent at the Change Square, Maidan or Sahat al-Tahrir, in the capital, Sana'a. Haman's presence as a woman in the streets of Sana'a and in the Change Square in the beginning of 2012 was not unique, however. In fact, some claim that many of the early protests in Yemen were led by women and youth, we should say. They were the forefront of the protest movement in Yemen, at least in the beginning. However, after a few weeks, the nature of the protests changed, and with that, women's role in it. By the summer of 2012, the peaceful revolution, Thawa Silmiya, became not only violent, but it was abducted in a way by powerful and more traditional players, the political opposition, military groups, and tribal forces, pushing gradually aside the already marginalized women and youth. And when we say that women are marginalized in Yemen, it means, for example, in terms of political representation, you have 2 ministers in Yemen, 2 members of the Shura Council, and only 1 parliament member who is a woman out of 301 delegates. Also, in terms of gender gap, we can refer to the Global Gender Gap Report. Yemen is one of the lowest performing countries in 2006. In many years, as you can see in the slide, she is the lowest one. It means large gaps and low performing rates of women in terms of politics, as we've seen in the previous slide, of economic empowerment, for example, in participation and opportunity in the labor market, positions, income gaps, access to bank loans, finance programs, ownership of other than land. We can say that women make up about 6 or 7% out of the labor force in Yemen, which makes about 90% gap. Large income gap, yeah, we said that. With the changing dynamics of the revolution and the involvement of neighboring countries and the UN, real opportunity for change was presented with the stepping down of former President Ali Abdullah Saleh in November 2012. It was viewed as a first step towards meaningful political and social reform. A new president elected and a temporary government was appointed in the beginning of 2012, and Yemen entered the transition period and was preparing for the NDC, the National Dialogue Conference. The NDC was more than a reconciliation effort to end the Yemeni crisis. It aimed at achieving sustainable and acceptable solutions for some of Yemen's long-standing problems, such as the separatist movement in the south and the northern issue of Sada, the Houthi movement, offering a federal plan denied by both parties. And it was also supposed to promote, of course, reform in the political system, resulting in a new constitution draft finished in the beginning of 2015. A preparatory committee of 31 members, 6 of whom women, was entrusted on the recruiting of the delegates to the NDC and assigning them to the different working groups or modalities for each issue. The real novelty was 30% quota reserved for women in the dialogue seats. In reality, it ended up being a little less, between 25 to 27% out of more than 500 delegates that participated in the dialogue. And Karman, of course, was one of them. I should note that the women in the various working groups mainly represented the urban and educated parts of Yemeni population, but this was a general feature of all participants in the transition process in the NDC. 10 months of dialogue ended in the beginning of 2014 in bad accord. It left things unfinished in terms of the Sada problems, the Houthis in the north, and in the southern issue. Women feared that the government would not be in a hurry to implement their NDC achievements, and they were not wrong about that. They made little progress before the Houthi forces started to advance the capital of Sana'a in the last months of 2014 and in the beginning of 2015. The reaction to the Houthi takeover of Sana'a and other areas in northern and central Yemen was the formation of a coalition headed by Saudi Arabia, declaring war against them in order to reinstall the lawful ousted government of President Hadi and to prevent Iran from establishing its grip on yet another Arab country in the region by assisting the Houthi rebels in Yemen. Yemen's transition process ended with a war, and women's achievements such as 30% quota in public life and an 18-year minimum age of marriage have fallen through. Under the areas ruled by Houthis, mainly in the north and some parts of central Yemen, women were restricted, and still are, by imposing, for example, male guardianship, requiring the approval of male guardian or mahram for all manner of activities, mainly written approvals, but in some cases like flying, a woman would need a man physically to accompany her to the plane. And in the south, in the coalition forces territories, women had to pay also the price of reconciliation between rival groups within the coalition inside Yemen, and witnessed an all-male cabinet formed in 2020, and later replaced by an all-man presidential leadership council in April 22, up until now. Both in the north and in the south, the war affects women in a disproportionate manner. The war has reinforced traditional gender roles and norms and limited sometimes women's opportunities and agency, even as they are forced to take on new responsibilities and challenges, like providing for their family members and navigating new risks and challenges in their communities. When we look at the effects of war from gender dimension, we can see that the conflict has resulted in displacement of millions of Yemenis, including women and children, who are often forced to leave their homes and communities behind and face new challenges and risks. It exposes women to greater vulnerability. Displacement is one result of the conflict-related violence, but for women and girls, war has also led to a rise in gender-based violence, including domestic violence, harassment, and exploitation of women. The war also disrupted education for many children, particularly for girls. Many schools have been closed or destroyed. Families cannot afford school fees or are afraid to send their daughters. We should say also, in some cases, their sons, the boys, to school due to safety concerns. The recruitment of boys, mainly in the Houthi areas, to war, the phenomena of boy soldiers, what is called تجنيد الأطفال. Economic hardship, mainly the loss of livelihood. The war led to a significant decline in economy, men losing their jobs, high unemployment rates, suffering war injuries. Women had to provide for their families. In addition, many women lost their jobs and faced greater difficulty in providing for themselves and for their family, especially in cases of displacement, sometimes more than once. Healthcare. Women and girls have limited access to healthcare due to damage or destruction of about half the healthcare facilities in Yemen. Also shortage of medical supplies, and because of restrictions of movements, not only in the south, but also, not only in the north, but also in the south. This has resulted in higher maternal mortality rates and limited access to reproductive health care. To that, we should add the rise in pregnancies during the war for several reasons. For example, unemployment of men and the increase of child marriage for economic and security reasons. In summary, gender inequalities in Yemen existed prior to the war, but the war aggravated these systematic and cultural inequalities and created new forms of violence and marginalization of women. Women in Yemen continue throughout the hardships of war to tackle the dual challenge, marginalized on the one hand and seeking for empowerment on the other hand. It is initiatives like, I think, Kauman and others that help empower women and girls on both a personal level and in their communities, and hopefully to inspire in the future of post-war Yemen, inshallah, a new generation of activists.